Trying to save every piece of equipment that shows up at your doorstep doesn't make much sense. Most machines have a lifespan, and when its time is up, that's it, it's gone. But what happens if your goal is to try and save it despite knowing how difficult it's going to be to find parts for it? Unfortunately, if you're not able to overcome these issues, there's always plan B, or worse yet, the scrapyard. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this very industrial looking McLean edger, and the problem is that despite getting the correct belt for it, it seems to break not long after being replaced. So the big question is the problem with the belts that we're using, or is there something wrong with the machine? Now this is not a complete repair video. In fact, this is a revisit of an older repair from years ago. So if you want to see the actual repair video, click on the link at the top of the screen. Otherwise, we're going to be talking about overcoming the problem of finding the correct parts or even equivalent parts for other machines. So as you can tell, this machine has been ran on a tight budget, which I don't have a problem with. However, this one's getting close to needing some special care. Now besides the obvious issue with the wheels, the other problem has to do with a throttle lever that doesn't seem to be throttling anything. Now just on a side note, it would seem that the throttle is supposed to be used to stop the engine by moving it into a very low idle speed. And just as expected, the oil level is very low and looks very dark as well, which means we'll need to take care of that, otherwise it may not last another year, let alone a decade. And even though I've heard a lot of great things about this particular style of carb, I'm not really fond of it. However, I am glad it's this one because a bowl type carb doesn't seem to take neglect as well as this one does. This brings up a great point because the fuel system on this engine is quite a bit older than most that you'll find, and even though finding the parts isn't tough, they can be very expensive when compared to a newer style. Now to prove my point, when neglected, this fuel tank will sometimes rust out, and when that happens, you're going to get holes in it. That means it will need to be replaced, and if so, I sure hope you've got a great credit score. So unless you can find a good used one, a new tank will set you back close to $100. That's right, you just blew your entire budget on one part. Now that is a huge drawback to having a metal fuel tank versus one made out of plastic, but if you take care of the machine, this really isn't a big deal. Of course, there are ways to fix a rusty and leaking metal fuel tank, but it may be beyond what most consumers are comfortable doing. Now, fortunately, this carb is still in demand, so the aftermarket has stepped in and is still making them, so luckily they are cheap and easy to find. But what if you don't want cheap? Well, get ready to shell out yet another $100 for it. Now, I know to some consumers, keeping a machine as original as possible is important to them, but at $100, that aftermarket carb is looking really good right about now. So far, we've looked at the possible problems with the fuel system, but what about other parts of this machine? How difficult are they going to be to find? So this engine didn't start. In fact, it didn't even do anything, which is not what you want to happen. We now have to start wondering how big the parts list is going to be because, as you heard earlier, this could get out of hand pretty quickly. The next most likely part that's keeping us from starting this engine could be a bad ignition system. Now the parts I'm talking about are the spark plug, the ignition coil, and to a lesser degree the flywheel, only because the magnets in it are not serviceable. Now at this point, I suspect the ignition coil might be faulty, which I sure hope it's not, because to get a new one, it's going to cost about $50 for an OEM one, or about half that much for an aftermarket one. Luckily, this inexpensive spark checker was able to confirm that we do have spark. Now all we have to do is get this engine started and running, and only then will we worry about the parts we'll need for the rest of this edger. Now sometimes on these diaphragm pump fuel systems, physically priming them with fuel will usually get them to work again. At least we know that we don't have to spend a lot of money on new parts, either OEM or aftermarket. But if your situation is different, you're going to have to make a difficult choice of either quality parts or just getting the thing working again. But the bigger question is, what happens when you finally need a part that is no longer being made? What are you supposed to do then? So unfortunately, that's exactly what happened on this project. Now, I won't spoil the surprise for you, but I did need to replace a part that hasn't been made in quite some time, and there was no guarantee as to when it was going to ever be made again. Well, this is when you need to get crafty and come up with a plan B or decide that it's not worth fixing at all. Now, don't worry, when we get to that part, I'll be sure to point it out to you. Now, there is a big drawback with having a plan B, and that is if you've gotten this far, you might as well make a plan C as well, because the likelihood that the first plan is going to work is slim at best. There's also another drawback if you have to be crafty when trying to replace a part with a different one. Now, someone mentioned that modifying parts on the machine could affect its asking price and possibly its sale altogether, which they do have a good point. So if plan B doesn't work and you have to move on to plan C, how do you think the person who's trying to buy the machine might view the modification? And they do have a great point. If the change is very drastic, then someone trying to buy it might not agree with how it's set up and just walk away from the deal. Now, I don't see this problem very often, and when I do, it's mostly on lawnmowers. The modification I come across the most is a bypass brake handle safety switch, and it's because the cable is usually broken. Now, to get around this problem, all you have to do is work the lever on the flywheel brake and then tie it off with either a piece of rope or some wire. Now, I've done this plenty of times, but I use it for testing purposes to make sure the engine will start and run. I would never sell a mower that's been bypassed in this way, and I would also recommend that you do the same. There's simply too much liability in it, and I certainly don't want to be any part of that situation. Now, despite this machine being well over 32 years old, there's still parts available for it, just not all of them. But if I had to replace a part that wasn't available and was just cracked or broken, I'd probably be looking into getting it welded versus replacing it. Now, the good part about this project is this is not my machine. Instead, it belongs to a coworker of mine, and they don't seem to be too hard up about keeping it stock, only that it works. That means I have quite a bit of liberty when it comes to taking a different approach if the situation comes up. Now, luckily, after looking at the arm for the blade, I was able to figure out that the belt they were using was indeed the correct size. And it was just a lack of maintenance that was keeping the arm from adjusting itself that was causing the belt to break. Now, not every edger is set up this way, so just check your owner's manual for the recommended maintenance routine. I'm not sure if it's going to mention anything about what I'm doing, but more than likely it should mention cleaning and lubricating other parts of the edger. Now, just to be clear, belts don't typically need to be changed all that often. In fact, I'm pretty sure that some that I've worked on were still using the original belt. Of course, belts haven't changed in the last couple of decades, so it's doubtful that you'll ever have an issue finding a replacement. The same goes for pulleys and ball bearings, so finding those parts should be pretty easy even if you don't have the part numbers. Now, I did ask my coworker what they wanted to do about the missing front wheel. And as usual, their main concern was cost. Unfortunately, a single replacement wheel was about $50, so they declined to do anything about it. So we finally come to the part that I had to make work, but it may not be that obvious to you. The problem was, according to the diagrams I was looking at, there were 4 part numbers listed for this part, probably accounting for other variations of this edger. Now, this one does look like the old part, but unfortunately, the cable's much too long. That means we'll have to cut a few inches off the cable to make it work, but the worst part is that it works backwards from how the broken one works. So why didn't I just order one of the other parts they had listed instead of this one? Well, as you might have guessed it, the one that I wanted was no longer being made, so I had to come up with a different plan, but on reflection, I wish I would have ordered a different one. Now, for those of you who are paying attention, you'll notice that the cable comes into the body of the assembly at the bottom. The cable then attaches to the lever past the pivot. What that means is that the cable moves in the opposite direction to how the lever moves. When you pull the cable backwards, the cable moves forward, but on the new one, the cable attaches to the lever before the pivot. That means the cable moves with the lever. Push the lever forward, so does the cable. If I had realized it then, I would have picked a different one, but the problem was that the lever would have also looked different from this one, which is something I was trying to avoid. So even though the pictures for the engine speed seem to match up between the two of them, they don't. So let me explain. With the original lever, if you pushed it forward, it would pull the cable backwards. This would then choke the carb and allow you to start the engine. After the engine was started, you can then pull the lever backwards to idle speed, which of course means the choke would move in the opposite direction, in this case, forward. But with this new lever, to choke the carb, you'll actually need to pull the lever in the wrong direction, in this case, backwards. Basically, anyone who didn't know about this would have a really tough time getting this edger to start. Now, I did let my coworker know about the lever situation, and they really didn't have an issue with it. Which is good, I guess, because more than likely, they're probably going to forget about it the next time they need to use it in the springtime, and I'm probably going to get a phone call about it. Now, I don't recall if I ended up relabeling the sticker with the new one with the correct directions on it, but I guess we'll see when spring comes back around. So it seems to be working very well, and as usual, the engine sounds great. They certainly don't make them like they used to anymore. Now for this project, I ended up buying a new belt, which they definitely needed, and a new backwards throttle lever. And in parts alone, the cost was only 18 bucks, which is a pretty good deal. Now they were really lucky because with a machine this old, it could have been a lot worse. So my question is, do you think I should have returned this throttle lever and gotten a different looking one so that it would have matched up with the instructions? Remember, there is no right or wrong answer to this one. This is simply how you feel about it. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.